Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk, ICRT's weekly interview segment, bringing you conversations from and about Taiwan. Today we are continuing our once-a-month series wherein we feature the work of one Cheung of the Taipei Times, specifically focusing on his work for his weekly column, Taiwan in Time, which takes out a little nugget of Taiwan history, dusts it off, and puts it up for everybody to see, appreciate, in the good old year 2016. So we have Han back on the show to do just that for us, to talk about his work from November. We've got 4 stories to go through. So Han, glad to have you back.
Thanks for having me here again.
All right, so 4 stories to get through. Like I said, a lot of these are on sort of the martial law era sort of themes, a lot of looking at society in transition, looking at society as it slowly changed and moved towards democracy. But before we get to that, we of course want to feature our monthly musician, somebody who, you know, made some contribution to Taiwan music, historically speaking. And this month we have a guy that's actually near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, we have, this week we have Cheung because the anniversary is he unfortunately died in a car accident on November 12th in 1997. And he was pretty young. And for me, it was his album was the first Mandarin pop album I had ever purchased in 1992.
And when we say album, just to be clear, we mean cassette. Isn't that right?
Yeah, Han? It was a cassette tape. This was 1992. Mm-hmm. I believe CDs were out then, but my family didn't have a CD player.
Stay true to your school.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is Mr. Cheung known for?
Like, he's known for his voice. He has a really high-pitched voice that's kind of similar to, like, the lead singer from Air Supply. And, yeah, he was really famous, really popular in the 80s and 90s. And he's also known for discovering Zhang Hui-mei and producing her first album.
Okay. So tragically died too young back in 1997. But you are going to start us off with one of his early hits. Is that right?
Yeah. This is Da Hai from the album of the same name, 1992, and that is the cassette tape that I bought.
It's too bad we can't dig that up to get the actual audio from that particular cassette. But in any event, this is Da Hai from Zhang Yusheng to take us to our first story. All right, we're coming into our first story for today. This was your November 6th article covering the week of November 7th through 13th, titled Defection to Freedom and then to Prison. Bit of a snarky title. And this is covering an event that occurred on November 8th in 1993.
Yeah, so on November 8th, 1993, this Chinese citizen, Wang Zhihua, he faked a bomb using soap and wire and hijacked a Chinese commercial plane and directed it to Taiwan. Yeah, and this was actually one of 12 successful hijackings that took place in a 14-month span. Between April 1993 and June 1994.
Busy period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he made it across, but reading your article, a lot of your article is sort of dedicated to figuring out how that period became as busy as it was.
Yeah.
So how about you bring us through the history of that a little bit?
So this was already after martial law was lifted, but during martial law, any Chinese defector who came to Taiwan would be heavily rewarded. And most of these were, almost all of these were military defections. So they just flew their MiGs.
So these were guys that were actual pilots. They didn't have to hijack a plane. They just stole the plane they were flying.
Right. They just stole the plane and then came to Taiwan. And then they would often be given like a rank in the ROC military and given lots of gold. And allowed to stay in Taiwan. So
given gold?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this kind of became like a trend where like these people would come here and that's the title. That's why my title is Defection to Freedom, because that's what the government would. In government rhetoric, that was what they were doing. They were escaping communist China and defecting to free Taiwan.
Free Taiwan, yeah.
Yeah.
Free China.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that was what was going on. And I think that's kind of what spurred people to hijack planes when, like, commercial planes became popular. And should note that back then there was no airport security. Like, people could bring knives onto planes, and you could pretty much, it was pretty lax. So it was
the
pretty
Wild West.
Easy to hijack a plane back then.
Good old days. The good old days. Makes you nostalgic. Okay, so then how did actual hijacking start?
The first time it was in May 1988. That was Zhang Qingguo and Long Guiyun. So they hijacked the first Chinese commercial plane to Taiwan, and they thought they were defecting to freedom like the military's people were doing. But actually, after they landed, times had changed, and they were...
Well, that was a year after martial law had technically ended.
Right. But
so they missed it by this much.
Yeah, but the period of mobilization for the suppression of communist rebellion was still in effect, so they could technically still be rewarded. So they did the move, but they were actually greeted as like anti-communist heroes defecting to freedom, but then they were accused of violating the Civilian Aviation Act. And
I mean, no matter how patriotic you are, you still hijacked a plane.
Yeah, they hijacked the plane. So the ROC, the Taiwan sent the plane and the passengers back, but then put the two in jail. So, but they served, they were sentenced to more than 3 years, but they served about half of it and were paroled and were allowed to live in Taiwan for the rest of their lives. So it was still kind of successful.
So wait, just so I get the scheme straight, this is a plane that was in mainland China, going to another location in mainland China, and then they threatened the pilot, and the pilot agreed to fly to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's pretty much what happened.
Cojones these guys had.
Yeah. And I think, like, some studies blame the Taiwan government's handling of this case because, they were still allowed to stay in Taiwan, and they served relatively light sentences. So other people were like, hey, like, I can just serve 2 years in jail and I can stay in Taiwan.
Interesting. So was Taiwan really that much better than China in those people's eyes? 2 years in jail was worth it? Probably.
And it's hard to say because there was a lot of propaganda going on. So, like, who knew really what was going on there? But a lot of these people were actually having trouble, like not happy with their jobs or not. A lot of the military defections were because they couldn't get promotions. And Wang Zhihua, the guy who I feature in this story, he was actually wanted for embezzlement. So, and that could be a pretty big crime in China. Like in Taiwan, at least, he thought he might not get, like, the death sentence or something serious like that.
Okay, so that brings us up to the late 80s. How do we get, more than a dozen hijackings in 1993?
I think it was just like a chain reaction. Like, one of them started and then it just went on and on. And I looked at this study that kind of explains that the Chinese media didn't really report on what happened to these people. So they kind of just either didn't report it on at all, and if they did, they just talked about the hijacking and complained that the Taiwanese government was keeping these people in Taiwan and instead of sending them back to China. And that kind of created the illusion that they were actually allowed to stay in Taiwan when actually they were sent straight to jail. And they weren't even allowed to, like, set foot outside of Taiwan. Like, even after their prison sentence ended, they were sent to this, like, holding cell to await deportation. So they actually never remained in Taiwan as a free person.
So is that what ended up happening to Wang Zhihua?
Yeah. And his case is even more unique because so he was the last of these hijackers to be sent back to China because he was involved in another hijacking. So he was scheduled, he was paroled early and he was scheduled to be sent back to China. And during the flight from Taiwan to Jingmen, where he would be transferred to the PRC, another passenger threatened held a official hostage and turned the plane back to China.
He just happened to be on the same plane?
Well,
I guess there was a lot of these hijackers being sent back on the same
there
plane.
were a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that person held an official hostage and turned the plane back to Taiwan.
Mm.
And they searched all the people on the plane, and they found a knife on him. Mm. So he was sentenced to jail again.
Mm-hmm.
And then after he got out, he had to wait to be deported, because they would send like all the illegal Chinese people who entered Taiwan back in batches.
Mm.
So it ended up that he remained in Taiwan until 2008.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So in a way, he got his wish.
Yep.
Just probably not the part of Taiwan that he wanted.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is a pretty weird story, because, I mean, we think of martial law ending kind of a clean break, but then this happens, years later. I don't quite know what to make of it all. Just a weird trend that kind of popped up.
Yeah.
A lot of people following the leader, kind of.
Yeah, I think so. And then after a while, people were finally catching on that, yeah, you were sent to jail, and there would be repercussions, and you weren't just allowed to live in Taiwan. So, and then it was also at that point where Taiwan and China both, especially China, started improving its airport security. So they bought X-ray machines, they hired like more guards, and they would like start doing luggage checks. And this kind of by 1995, it kind of eradicated the problem. There was one more that happened after that, and that was it.
All right. Interesting little slice of history right there. Let's move on to our next story, though, and we have another song from singer Zhang Yusheng.
Yeah, this is 我的未来不是梦. So My Future is Not a Dream. It's a really positive song about just following your dreams and aspirations. And this was his first hit. It was featured in the soda commercial.
You dream big, everybody. Dream soda big. All right.
Yep.
So this is My Future is Not a Dream by Zhang Yusheng to take us into the second story. All right, and moving on to our second story. This is your article for November 13th. This one takes us back all the way to that week in November of 1977, so just a touch further back in history, with an article titled Burning Down the Establishment. And this is an interesting one, because we're still dealing with martial law era sort of issues. But this one is more of like a turning point within that period, where it felt like momentum was slowly gathering on the side of ending martial law. So tell us about this article.
So this is about the Zhongli incident that took place on November 19th, 1977. That day was one of the biggest election events in Taiwan history. And basically, people were angry. There had been rumors of like KMT fixing elections to prevent like opposition politicians from being elected. And it was still a one-party rule back then, but independent candidates were also allowed to run. And so this was kind of like when things just kind of boiled over. And it started from a small incident. It was like an elderly couple who went to vote for the Taoyuan County Commissioner, and they wanted to vote for Xu Xingliang, who was an ex-KMT who was like expelled for criticizing the party's policies. Mm-hmm. And so obviously the KMT wasn't happy with this guy, and what happened was they nominated someone to run for that office, and he's like, no, I want it. So he ran, he put his name into the hat, and also he wrote 2 books earlier that year criticizing the KMT, so they kicked him out of the party. And so they wanted to vote for him, and their votes were voided.
So they looked at their vote and they said, wrong answer, and they threw him into the trash can.
Yeah, like the presiding officer had an explanation. He said that they kept talking to each other and they wouldn't go to separate voting booths, and they used the wrong stamp. So that was the official explanation, but whether that was true or not, the people were just angry. They couldn't take it anymore, so they took to the streets, and it turned into this big riot that ended up like burning the Zhongli police station down.
That's a riot. That's a real riot. Okay.
Yeah. So this was the first. This was pretty much the first protests, like civil unrest, kind of turned violent since 228. So there was like 30 years of relatively, how do we put it, stable rule with no major incidents.
And so what was the police response like?
The police, so two police fired into the crowd like during the incident when things were getting out of hand, and two people died, but the government didn't retaliate or try to really suppress any of this. And Jiang Jingguo actually forbade the army from interfering. And as a result, he actually beefed up his riot police, but he didn't really resort to any 228 style repercussions.
Just kind of left it there.
Yeah.
And so this Xu Xinliang guy, did he actually win?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So they actually had, these people were monitoring, and then after the incident, they actually counted each vote and announced it and did it openly.
Because people were pretty suspicious at that point.
Yeah. So he won. And he would go on to be one of like a big Dangwai, so like opposition figure.
Out of the party.
Yeah, out of the party.
Dangwai. Okay, and so in your article, you're kind of arguing that this is a real transition moment for that Dangwai movement, for that pro-democracy movement.
Yeah, because there were Dangwai in the elections before that, but this really brought them together, kind of. Because right after the incident, they formed the Dangwai Personages Election Assistant Group in 1978, and then other politicians were also starting to be more outspoken, and like Liu Xiulian, former vice president, she also released books criticizing the KMT, and it just started, their voice started being heard more. And of course, there were still many incidents to come, like the Kaohsiung incident, and the KMT actually suspended elections after the U.S. broke off relations with Taiwan, which caused much displeasure. But to many historians, this was the beginning.
And I guess probably maybe one way to look at it is these were the first two to really push their luck. These were the first two to be brave, or maybe just angry and headstrong enough to really stick it to the cops and push it forward. And then when other people saw that, there was repression, but it wasn't of the same level that you would have seen 30 years older, it maybe emboldened a lot of people that were feeling the same way.
Yeah, for sure. Like, of course, we don't condone burning down any building, but it was symbolic.
And maybe you could tell me a little bit. I mean, I honestly, I did not know that there was that level of political organization, even in the form. I guess I just didn't know too much in general about how quote unquote democracy worked during the martial law period. So there was a sizable opposition at that point. Yeah,
there was. But before that, most of them just ran as independent candidates. It was just like someone who wanted to have a say in the government. Like it wasn't really an organized movement, since other parties other than the KMT were not allowed.
And so the KMT, were they taking steps to kind of keep the other independent politicians in control? That's what
people were saying. Like there were a lot of rumors and incidents, and such as like Guo Yuxing's case, where he was an independent that ran for Yilan Yilan County Commissioner. Yeah, there's a story that like he lost the election, and then they found bags of votes for him that were discarded. And so there were a lot of incidents like that were going on that made people suspicious that the KMT was purposely trying to keep these people out of power.
And so the figures that are involved in all this, like Xu Xinliang and the couple, are they still any kind of, do they still have any kind of presence in Taiwan politics?
Yeah, so Xu Xinliang went on to become the chairperson at one point of the DPP. And he also ran for president in 2000 and didn't win.
Well, obviously, yeah. Okay, well, good effort there. Let's move on, though, to our next story, and therefore our next little transition music from Zhang Yusheng. And what do we have next?
We have 没有烟抽的日子. So, like, the days where
you don't even have a cigarette to smoke.
Yeah, that's a good translation. So this is an interesting song. It was actually penned by Wang. The lyrics were written by Wang Dan, who was a famous Chinese student activist, and so he wrote this poem that Zhang Yusheng turned into a song, and it became a popular. So this Chinese guy wrote the lyrics, Zhang Yusheng wrote the music, and then it went back to China and became like a protest song, like during the Tiananmen incident, and so it became kind of like a symbolic, protest song in China.
Oh wow!
And
so
it was also popular in Taiwan.
So little involvement in history as well. All right, so this is Zhang Yusheng once again bringing us up to the third story. All right, and on to our third story now. This story covering the week of November 21st, and the actual day that we're focused on is November 23rd, 1927, which is the day that one guy who is often known as Taiwan's Sherlock Holmes was born, and that is the name of your article, Taiwan's Sherlock Holmes. So who was this guy who was born on November 23rd, 1927?
So this guy was Yang Risong, and he was a forensics expert at the Taiwan Provincial Police Administration.
Okay, so a forensic expert who went on to great things. How did he become so renowned?
He presided over a lot of high-profile cases, and he was able to find a lot of evidence that would often like turn cases around. And he had some pretty unorthodox methods, like he never wore gloves or masks, and he would actually taste the fluids of the bodies and like the contents of the dead person's stomach, and he said that was the only way to really tell that if they had been poisoned or how long they were dead or that kind of thing. So,
Okay, that's not a form of forensic science you see on CSI too terribly often. Pretty gross. Okay, so if he's doing such crazy stuff, he must have some credibility. How did he get his credibility in the first place?
It was 1949. He was a 21-year intern. And so there was this case then where like a couple allegedly hung themselves with one noose, and the woman died and the man survived allegedly by putting his finger between his neck and the rope.
So that's the story he gave.
Yeah. And then so the local police district announced that it was a double suicide, but the police headquarters still thought something was fishy, so they sent the Yang, who was pretty promising intern. And
an intern. They sent the intern?
Yeah. And back then there really weren't that many people studying forensic science in medical college. He was the only one in his class.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So everybody else wanted to be doctors.
Yeah, because doctors made more money and you didn't have to deal with dead people.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, ideally not, yeah.
Right. So, they sent him, and he quickly looked at the noose and found that it wasn't large enough to hold 2 people. So by this simple deduction, the police questioned the man again, and he admitted to staging the whole thing, and he had killed the women.
Quite elementary.
Yep, and he even forged a suicide note.
Oh, the suspect.
Yeah, he's forged a suicide note that was printed in the newspaper and went viral. As far as viral goes back then.
Back in 1949.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of his first case, gets him on the scene, gets him a bit of credibility. And then he goes on to lick a bunch of dead bodies, apparently, and doesn't get kicked out, as most people would get kicked out of their job if they went around licking dead bodies.
Yeah.
But I guess he had some other claims to fame, some other big cases he cracked.
Yeah. So he went on to do like quite a few. Like he went in 1977. This was another notable case. It was Taiwan's first dismemberment case. So yeah, and he actually just
we're not broadcasting this story. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and the head wasn't found until many days later. And he was just tirelessly working with these body parts, like we're still without gloves or a mask, and he finally, through like a bunch of clues, teeth and stuff like that, was able to identify the body. So that was one pretty high profile case. And then there was the murder of the Japanese tourist that was pretty big in 1990, and he was able to identify the body, because the body was found like almost a year later after she disappeared. So there was not much to work with, but he was able to identify who it was. And then there were several more high profile cases involving like political activists and politicians and stuff like that. But then I think the biggest one was in Cheung, the Marine captain who was found dead in the ocean, and the military said it was a suicide. But Yang actually like looked at the body and looked at the material in his lungs and looked at the way he died and all the wounds on him, and deduced that he had been murdered. And this actually led to the unraveling of like a big military scandal, and it became common knowledge that Ying Qingfeng was murdered, even though the case remains unsolved today, but he was able to prove that, so that made him even more famous.
Okay, so sorry about all of that, guys. If you can sit through CSI, you can sit through us describing all of this.
Yeah, no pictures.
But just to get even a little bit grosser about everything, so what's the deal? What was his justification for no gloves and the taste testing and all that?
Well, first of all, the gloves, he explains that he cannot feel the elasticity of the skin if he has his gloves on. And then with the mask, he said he could smell the bodies and kind of determine the time of death, or like he cites one case where they brought in 3 charred bodies from the same incident, and he's quoted to have said that they smelled the same, so I could tell that they were burned at the same time. If I wore a mask, I would not be able to notice this subtle detail.
The dead bodies, they're all about the subtle details.
Yep.
You got to take them all in. Ugh.
And then furthermore, he said he believed that wearing a mask was disrespectful towards the deceased.
Huh,
and
okay.
This guy believed in spirits and stuff.
So he was kind of a superstitious guy.
He was, yeah. So that was part of it.
Huh. I mean, I'm sure he was a smart guy and everything, but this kind of sounds like BS. I mean, has anybody looked into whether or not this stuff he was talking about really works?
We're not sure. I actually read something that it was theatrical. Like he would purposely do this kind of stuff in front of reporters, and he would actually touch the body with his middle finger and then lick his index finger. So there were some talks about this, but we really don't know. But it's quite possible that it's true.
Just has some heightened senses that the rest of us don't have and don't want.
Yeah.
Well, if CSI went this way, it would be a very different show. Thankfully, they chose to go a slightly different direction. So this is kind of an interesting guy, as we've discussed here. I guess the thing that kind of catches my notice is, as you say, he was a little bit superstitious, and it's just interesting that such, a pioneer in a very particular science was still quite a superstitious person. So I don't know, does that say anything about like this period and the way that science was sort of dealt with at the time?
Yeah, there seemed to be no like contradiction between like believing in spirits and actually working with the dead. And actually that was one of his reasons. He wanted to, he said he wanted to bring peace, two kinds of pieces, like one...
As in Peasce.
Yeah, sorry.
We'll leave it in. This is radio. We don't need to spell correctly.
Okay, yeah. So Peace. First one was to bring peace to like society and the dead person's family members by like finding out what exactly happened. And the second was to bring peace to the dead person by finding out what happened or helping identify the person that killed them. So this would bring... so he wanted them to rest in peace because he did believe in their spirits. So that kind of actually fueled his work.
If there's anything that's going to make you respecting dead bodies, it's a belief in them coming back. So very reasonable there. All right, let's wrap that one up in a bow and never look back and never think of it again. Sorry, everybody, if I scarred anyone out there. But we are going to go back to some pretty music to take our minds off all the dead bodies and ghouls and whatnot. Once again, from Zhang Yusheng, what do we got here?
This is 口是心非. So basically you're saying something that's different from what your heart is. And this was in his last album, the one where he released before he died in 1997.
All right, so this is 口是心非 to take us up to the final story for today.
口是心非，你深情的沉默，都随着西风飘渺远走。诗人梦话，我钟情的依托，就像枯萎凋零的花朵。星火燎原，我热情的眼眸，曾点亮最灿烂的天空。
All right, and we're going to slide right in now to our fourth and final story for the show today. This one is covering the final month of November, and I have two dates that we can kind of work with here. Both are for a venerable politician of Taiwan's mid-century period. And the two dates are December 2nd, 1989, and then going back a little bit further, December 3rd, 1983. Both of these are important dates for her political trajectory. Who are we talking about here, and what did she do?
We're talking about Yu Chen-yue-ying, and the two dates are December 3rd, 1983, she became a legislator, and December 2nd, 1989, she was elected county commissioner of Kaohsiung for the second time, and she's the first female county commissioner in Taiwan ever. But what makes her story really remarkable is she knew nothing about politics. She was just helping a regular housewife and helping in the family business until she was 38. And she was suddenly called by her father-in-law, who was a big independent politician, to run for office. And she did it. And then this turned into a long political career where she actually was successfully elected to a variety of public offices for the next 30 years and even served as an advisor for Chen Shui-bian into the 2000s. And it was kind of like a beginning of the Yu political family dynasty. As her brother-in-law ran, her sister-in-law, her son, all three of her children served as like legislators at some point.
So power family right there. Let's go back to how her political career started. So it was kind of almost an accident. It kind of fell into her lap almost.
Yeah. She was actually 4 months pregnant during that time.
Oh.
And her father-in-law was Yu Dengfa, which was he was former Kaohsiung County Commissioner who was dismissed and sent to jail in a scandal. And Yu Chen-yue-ying writes in the book that he was framed by the KMT, but
who knows?
That's another story that we're not going to look into today. But that's because of that, he was not allowed to run anymore. But he wanted to, as an independent candidate, he wanted to keep supporting people to run as an opposition because he thought like more competition would lead to politics improving, and he just didn't want the KMT to dominate the whole thing.
So this is back in the early 1960s, and so she would be part of that Dongwai movement?
Yeah. It wasn't known as Dongwai back then, but yeah, she would be. And and so basically he was looking for people to run, and he couldn't find anybody who wanted to oppose the KMT, because like, why would you fight a losing battle? And so finally he got his candidate, and she backed out 3 days before the registration deadline, and he was left with no choice. He wanted a woman because there were guaranteed seats for women in the provincial assembly back then, and he thought that if he didn't send any opposition, the KMT would just win by proxy by sending women to take those seats. So he insisted on finding a opposition female candidate. And with no choice, he asked his pregnant daughter-in-law to run. And she was like, sure, even though she knew nothing about politics and never thought she would become a politician.
I don't know that much about, the birthing rituals in Taiwan or the chanchi, like the special soups or whatever that you're supposed to have, but I'm pretty sure running for public office is not one of the things you're supposed to be doing when you're having a baby.
Definitely not. And but she just ran into it. She was like, she writes in her memoir that she wasn't prepared at all, but she wasn't scared either. So she just kind of jumped into it. She admits that she got elected because of her father-in-law's influence, but then and her husband actually just told her to keep quiet and just
in the legislature,
or
in the assembly.
In the assembly,
yeah.
And she writes in her memoir that that was something she could not do, and she actually took her job seriously and learned from other opposition politicians. And when her term ended, she decided on her own to run for a second term.
So she kind of got a taste for it over the course of the first couple of years.
Yeah, she actually liked it, and then it turned into 5 terms. And then after that, she ran for the legislature. She ran for the legislature, and then won a seat there. And then after that, she became the Kaohsiung County Commissioner, which was the first time there was a female county commissioner in Taiwan's history. And she did that for 2 terms, and then after that, her son succeeded her and ran for 2 more terms. So in all, 4 of her family members served as Kaohsiung County Commissioner for a total of 6 terms.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they're especially a political dynasty in Kaohsiung more than anything else.
Right.
Okay, so this is quite an interesting figure. I mean, you say that when she started way back in the 1960s, that was before people were even using this term Dongwai.
Yeah.
But would she be considered to be sort of a part of this broader challenge to the KMT and moving towards, more of a multipolar political system, a political system that has some competition with the KMT?
Yeah. Like, that was the whole idea behind her running, was to just provide some competition, and so it was not just like a one-party thing. And while in office, she also addressed a lot of the social, like the injustices and like voter fraud, and like so she often spoke out against KMT policies and tried to promote more democracy. Like, she spoke out when they tried to cancel the elections for like borough and village chiefs, and they tried to make that appointed, and she was not happy with that, and she actually spoke out in the assembly. This was all during her first term. So
hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Now, again, I guess this is just a period of politics that I really don't understand. How, if you're an independent candidate and you're not part of the party, how independent could you really be? I mean, how far could they push this envelope? Was it really, you go to that assembly session and you see real debates taking place, or is it more for show? What's your sense of all that?
I'm not sure how much clout they really had, but she stated that she would avoid the ideological issues or like the major clashes, and she avoided like directly clashing with the majority. She worked on more on like the people's problems, like farmers' rights and fair elections and like that kind of stuff. So she knew how to pick her battles, and she chose the ones that were more plausible, and she didn't try to like go all out, and because that would definitely get her in trouble.
Now, it's kind of interesting. When I was prepping for this and I was looking at some of these articles, there were a couple of comments on your second article, the Burning Down the Establishment article, that were accusing you of giving a very biased rendition of that piece of history. Again, we're talking about the 1977 Zhongli incident, where that elderly couple kind of pushed the point, made sure that their vote counted, even though it wasn't for the KMT. And I guess in this commenter's mind, you were doing too much to highlight the negative things that the KMT did during that period, and not enough to highlight the positive things. What is your sense of that? I mean, I obviously this is a big debate that's going on in how Taiwan's history should be portrayed in textbooks for all levels of education. Is it inherently biased to talk about these incidents, or is there any way to give a more balanced approach? How should we even be thinking about this?
Yeah, it does seem like in a lot of articles you just end up criticizing the KMT because it was a dictatorship, and it was a one-party rule, and there was a lot of suppression of many things, like even cultural activities in history. And it's interesting because a lot of this didn't really come to light until the last 20 years, because they portrayed this image that they were democratic, they had elections, and it was free China. Like it was a place, it was a beacon of freedom. They were like anti-communist. So there was all this positive image that they built up. And then in the last 20 years, it comes crashing down. So I'm sure they did a lot of positive things by as far as like economy and building infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. But when you really look back into these incidents, a lot of it is about uncovering like what people didn't know or what people still don't know. And I remember I moved to Taiwan in I first came in 1986, and then I settled in 1989. So it was still during that period where we were still required to be like patriotic in schools, and we had no idea this was going on. And now looking back at it, that's why I put an emphasis on kind of uncovering these things. And that might lead to it seeming that I'm biased. But I try to give the KMT side of the story too. Like I do explain what the guard said and why he voided their votes, and so yeah, a lot of it is just like debunking a lot of things, or like just rewriting history that was rewritten or just was not
portrayed
true
incorrectly the first time around. Yeah,
and that kind of comes at the expense of the KMT a lot of times.
Well, if you're somebody that believes that the opening up to multi-party rule was a good thing, obviously the KMT made a lot of steps to prevent that from happening. So whenever you point out one of those actions, it's inevitably, in retrospect, gonna look like a bad thing. There's really no way around that.
Yeah, and it's like if you want to emphasize like the road to democracy and what we enjoy now with the free elections and everything, you kind of have to go there.
All right, so take that, Taipei Times commenter. Actually, I'm just kidding. We are open to any viewpoints. We're happy to entertain any ideas on the show, but of course, always rooted in historical fact, which is what you look at each and every week in your column, Taiwan in Time, which we discuss each and every month. And we will do so again next month for the month of December, but we're going to have to round it out here. Once again, our musical artist that we highlighted was Cheung, who in Han's boyhood days just I melted your hearts and made your days bright as they possibly could be with all of his cassette tapes. But nevertheless, we're going to have to round things out there. Han Cheung, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And thank you all for listening. Please do join us again next time on Taiwan This Week. Next week, we will be back to our normal format with an interview, so stay tuned for that. See you next time.